Hey, no big deal, just me in a hammock out by the lake, ready to teach y'all about the First Great Awakening, all in a day's work. So there are two events in the 1700s that really contribute to the growing American sense of unity and national identity, and then also thus the revolution. The first is sort of an evangelical revival that occurs. Basically, there are a few generations in as far as settlers. There are a lot of younger people who were born and raised in the Americas who aren't maybe as devout as like the Puritans once were or the Anglicans who came over. And so there's a revival called the First Great Awakening in the 1730s, 1740s. It's kind of like the Protestant Reformation 2.0. There's a lot of like traveling lay preachers. It's a lot of like personal relationship with God. You should like read the Bible, write your thoughts. You should pray on your own. It's kind of breaking down a lot of the hierarchy, even of like the puritanical church. This creates distinctly American denominations like the Baptists and the Methodists. It brings Christianity to a lot more enslaved people on plantations, and it just primes the colonists to kind of unite and push against other hierarchies. Okay, so the other big event that leads us to the American Revolution in the 1700s is going to be the French and Indian War, in which the American colonists and the British fight the French and the Indians. Well, some of the indigenous people, some fight with us, like the Iroquois Confederacy. This is part of a bigger global conflict between the English and the French called the 7 Years' War, but what the American colonists specifically really want is to be able to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, especially Ohio. Yes, we fight a whole war over Ohio. We see the rise of some distinctly American generals, like a young 22-year-old George Washington. And there's a little bit of American colonial unity. This is when Benjamin Franklin makes his Join or Die cartoon, although it's like, I don't know, they're still all fighting as colonial militias. Yada, 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 the British win, but the problem is that they're in so much debt that they can't really do anything with their victory. Like, they don't have enough money to actually administer the territories west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they issued the proclamation of 1763 where they're like, hey, Americans, actually don't go west. We're going to preserve that land for the indigenous people. And we're like, what? They also allow French Canadians to continue practicing Roman Catholicism. And we're like, huh? But the biggest outcome is British debt. Hey, I'm walking my dog, but we got to talk about taxes as the main cause of the American Revolution. And I'm going to argue that they actually weren't. Say hi to Ringo. So for the last 150 years or so, the British had been mostly leaving the colonists alone. It's called benign neglect. But now that they're in so much debt, that's going to change. They're going to have to start raising their taxes. And they did raise a lot of the taxes, and that did really anger a lot of the colonists who were, a lot of times struggling to get by in the colonies. But even by 1763, English people back in England were paying taxes at a higher rate of 26-1. So, it wasn't like that egregious. There were times when England actually listened to the colonists' complaints, like when the King repealed the Stamp Act. And the Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea. So what was the Boston Tea Party all about? A lot of the members of the Sons of Liberty who did the Boston Tea Party were illegal tea smugglers. And so they were actually mad that the British were lowering the price of their legitimate British East India Company tea that was going to cut into their illegal business. Again, Americans do truly hate taxes, but the issue is more about representation. Follow for part 2. We talked in the last video about the whole no taxation part as a cause of the American Revolution. Now we need to talk about the without representation, because I think this is way more important and really more of the thing that a lot of the colonists were mad about. Their philosophical argument, at least, was that we're willing to be taxed as English people if we're going to also be treated with all the same rights as English people. Now the trick is they weren't being taxed as English people. I mentioned in my last video that English people in England were paying taxes 26 times higher than the American colonists, even by 1763. This is something we don't think about very often. Why didn't the English just give them representation? Why not? Why not keep these 13 colonies and just give them some representation? I don't know, let each of their different little councils and House of Burgesses, whatever, elect one representative to go sit in Parliament. Like, why not do that and maintain these colonies? And there's actually a few really interesting reasons why not. One is just logistics. Like, would the representatives live in England? Would they live in the American colonies? It took a long time to go back and forth. And so if they lived in the American colonies, then for every single vote, would they have to like get on a ship, go back, Parliament have to sit and wait for them? Would they live in England? And if so, then are they really a colonist anymore at all? The second issue is what precedent it would set. The British Empire is growing. So by 1763, they've gained control of Bengal, which means they're gaining more influence in South Asia and India. They're really looking to expand. And so they're thinking, okay, well, if we set this precedent that we're going to allow colonists to be represented in our parliament, now there's a difference between, English descended colonists in the Americas and Bengali people, for example, at least from the English point of view. But still, that's a dangerous precedent to set. But really the most interesting and complex reason why the king and the parliament were not willing to give the colonists actual representation in parliament is all about actually English politics. So the English were still reeling from their own civil war. I did a YouTube video series with Tupel for School on the English Civil War. You should go check it out. Basically, the royalists, right? So the people who supported the king and kind of the elite, the traditional gentry class that were in Parliament, were facing growing opposition from more democratically minded people in Parliament. And those traditional elites understood that if American colonists joined Parliament, they would most likely vote in a bloc with their opposition. As in most revolutions, although actually I would argue the American Revolution sets the precedent for the other revolutions, this whole no taxation without representation thing, like the founding father level elites in the revolutionary movement probably understood that Parliament was never going to give them an equal voice and that they weren't actually being taxed that unreasonably. But what this does is it provides a very convenient and compact unifying rallying cry, no taxation without representation, to organize the colonists together, finally to join or die like they didn't quite do in the French and Indian War, to then create something new, where then those founding father level elites, the Georges, the Thomases, the Hamiltons, whatever, will be in charge.